Hey everybody. So, I hope you're ready. I'm going to show you my professional podcaster studio. Dun dun dun. Yes, that's right. It is my closet. It is seriously cramped in here. All right. And I kind of like it like that. I like it with all the clothes and stuff in the way because it mutes sound. Don't know if you can tell, but it's a lot quieter in here. Yes, I am sitting down. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people don't believe in it. I'm a big wuss. I don't know what to tell you, but I've just always found it works better to record sitting down. So, yesterday I recorded for about an hour, and my microphone lost about half of it because the thing was full and didn't tell me the SD card was full. So today we're going to record the other half. I'm going to pause for about 15 seconds just to give it the level, because later on we're going to use a noise removal that gets rid of gets rid of that hum. And here we go. Okay. Normally when I do that, I try to actually hold my breath. So, okay, here we go. Yeah, okay. So this is Invito Rex, Chapter 11, Part 2. She blinked at him for a moment, fanning herself lazily. Then she leaned forward, snapped the fan shut, and said, "Only if I get to call you Vinny." Dizzy recognized that smile from years of seeing it in the mirror. "I suppose you want to ask about your father." Well, actually, yeah, sure. Now the cat's out of the bag, I guess it's okay to tell me about him, huh?" By the way, I'm going to stop a lot and redo stuff because every time it doesn't sound right, I tend to reread it. So if that's boring, I apologize, but yeah, it's boring. We lost it. There we go. She blinked at him for a moment, fanning herself lazily. Then she leaned forward, snapped the fan shut, and said, "Only if I get to call you Vinny." Dizzy recognized that smile from years of seeing it in the mirror. "I suppose you want to ask about your father." Well, actually, yeah, sure. Now that the cat's out of the bag, I guess it's okay to tell me about him, huh?" "Sure. Well, the first thing you should know is that he was a good man. I don't mean he was a good king or a noble ruler or any of that crap. I mean that if he had nothing, he would still have had any woman he wanted." Dizzy raised an eyebrow. "I don't know if that's the kind of thing I was hoping to hear about." She slapped him lightly with the fan. "That's not what I mean. I mean he was the kind of man people loved. He was strong, loyal, brave, and kind. When he walked down the street, people waved at him and called out to him." Dizzy chuffed. "Of course they did. He was the king." "No, you silly boy." She frowned a bit. "What have they told you about King Richard?" He shrugged. "Nothing. I mean, my history training didn't go much into modern monarchy, and honestly, I spent more time learning how to infiltrate the lower nobility. I never cared about the higher echelon until, well, a couple of days ago." She nodded. "And no one's talked to you about him while you were here?" "It's only been a couple of days. I've been busy screwing up the country, losing games for high stakes, and learning how what I eat becomes a matter of national importance." "That's fair." She sat back in her chair. Dizzy was surprised at how quickly she changed from the prim and proper lady to a normal commoner. She sighed. "So, your father hated this job." Dizzy chuffed. Wait, he chuffed just a little while ago. He smiled instead. Dizzy smiled. "Well, that seems to run in the family. From what I can tell, Cadvin didn't like it any better." "Yeah, see, at the time, I was working a long con on a quickly rising nobleman. I was going to be his dusky secret desire." She smiled and laughed at an unspoken joke. I was invited to a royal ball, which made me a little nervous. Dizzy nodded. He knew the feeling well. You were afraid you'd be found out? Oh, no. Well, not for myself, I mean. If anybody asked me, I'd just tell them I was a commoner. It hurt my boy toy's reputation, but that wasn't my problem. She stared off into the middle distance. I think he wanted to be found out. Being unmasked at a ball would be easier in some ways than having to admit to his wife that he loved someone else. She sighed. But then, while at the ball, I happened to dance by the king, who took a fancy to me. He invited me to dance and sat and talked with me. In many ways, he solved my escort's marital problems, although I doubt he'd thank Richard for it. That's not good. In some ways, I think he solved my escort's marital problem for him, but I doubt the boy toy would thank Richard for it. Dizzy marveled at how easily she referred to good King Richard, first of his name, so casually. She said, At first, the very first, I mean, I think he was attracted by my looks. I was so much more beautiful then. She sighed. And another grin touched her face. But when he found out I was a commoner, well, he was sold. He asked me all kinds of questions about my life. How did one get a job? How do you know how much food to buy without it going rotten? And what do you do when you're not working in the coal mines? I'm sure he'd seen commoners before, but I don't think he ever had a glimpse of how they really lived, and it fascinated him. So I figured, here's my new pigeon. I was still working the long con, but good grief, you only get so many easy marks in life. I figured I had to grab this one, and after all, he wasn't too hard on the eyes. I offered to show him what it was like to be a commoner. He would, ever so often, duck his security and come out to Brooklyn where we had a house. He told everyone he was a carpenter. Woodworker, really. It's a position that's got some prestige among the lower classes, 'cause you deal with the knobs, but not nobility himself, if you get me. It's a position that's got some prestige among the lower classes, 'cause you deal with the knobs, but you're not really nobility itself, if you get me. It's a position that's got some prestige among the lower classes, because you deal with the knobs, but you're not nobility yourself, if you get me. Dizzy nodded. So you're telling me that the king of all the Americas went to a... Dizzy nodded. So you're telling me that the king of all the Americas went to Brooklyn and played at being a commoner? She shrugged. Everybody's got a secret. He gave me cash so I could rent the place. Then every couple of weeks he came out and we played house for a while. Never more than a few days at a time. What did he do while he was out there? Just walk the streets and say, Hello, fellow commoner? She grinned. Nah. He'd go to the bar, hang out with the guys, complain about the new health care quotas, same as the other laborers. He'd listen to them tell their tales of woe, shake his head at the unfairness of it all, then go back to his lap of... Let's change that to the lap of luxury. Rolls off the tongue better. He listened to them tell their tales of woe, shake his head at the unfairness of it all, then go back to the lap of luxury. Dizzy frowned. Don't look down on him for that. This life isn't exactly easy. There's a lot of commoners who have it better because they've got a living and don't have to worry about anybody else. He pointed a finger south. There's people out there who have clothes on their backs, a roof over their head, and not a care in the world because we are watching out for them. All they have to do is some menial labor that they're well trained and skilled at. We have to make decisions every day that ruin somebody's life. We have to... What? Vicky sat back in her chair. Fingers laced over her belly. Nothing, kid. It's just that... She sighed. You reminded me so much of your father right then. She took a deep breath and said, "So that's what he did. Most days I'd tell people he was on assignment, making some kind of table or door molding for a nobleman. And then when he came home, we'd go to the market. Oh, he used to love going to the market. He was always amazed to see people concentrating so hard about what foods to buy, checking the labels and comparing prices. Don't get me wrong, he understood why. It was just culture shock." He'd visit with the neighbors. He'd go out to the bars with friends. She wiped away a tear. "You know what he used to do every Sunday? I mean, if he was home with us, every Sunday he'd invite the whole neighborhood over, and we'd have a big party in the backyard. He said it was his way of thanking them for taking care of his little lady while he was away. When they had babies, he was overjoyed for them. When they lost family, he mourned with them. When they lost their jobs, I had to nearly hold him down to keep him from throwing money at him." Dizzy nodded. "But he didn't just leave him alone, did he?" She smiled again. "I couldn't stop him. I told him it would blow his disguise, but your father was born to help people. He worked through other channels, found noblemen who talked to noblemen, found a place for those people to work. Nobody on that street ever starved for long." The smile on her face began to dim. "I think that was how he got caught. Somebody noticed him helping people and it got back to the palace." Dizzy asked, "Caught? How could he get caught? It's not like he was breaking any laws." She shook her head sadly. "There's many ways to get in trouble, kid, and there are far too many ways to get punished for upsetting the apple cart. One day I come home from visiting a friend to find Ashford Dunham standing in the living room. He's got a couple bruises flanking him. I figure I'm pinched, and I'm thinking about running, but there's another one who closes the door behind me, and I stands there. I figure I'm pinched. I'm thinking about running, but there's another one who closes the door behind me and stands there, blocking it. So I turned back to Ashford, and you know what he's like. He was standing there looking immaculate and polished in my dingy little living room, his nose up high in the air, and he says, "This charade is ended." She squinted in anger. "Imagine the pompous bastard just standing there and talking like we were in the middle of a royal dinner. This charade." She shook her head. "After that, it was all business. He didn't know anything about my past, but he figured me for a grifter, and there's only two... He didn't know anything about my past, but he figured me for a grifter, and there's really only two ways to get rid of a talented grifter. You pay them or you kill them. I lucked out. He chose the money." "He offered me a few years' wages for a woodworker in exchange for keeping my trap shut. He said he was buying the house from me, which seemed like an odd thing to do." Vicky pointed a finger at Dizzy. "Keep that in mind. That's how Dunham thinks. Everything proper, everything explainable. He bought me off considering how much I would have made in life insurance, then added the cost of the house. None of this $1 million or I cut off your head nonsense. None of this $1 million or I cut off your head nonsense. In his mind, Ashford was just doing business, so every part of the transaction had to have a purpose. In exchange, I had to move out of Brooklyn. I couldn't contact Robert again, and I couldn't tell anyone about our time together." He asked me if I was pregnant, and I lied. I hadn't told Richard, and I'd be damned if he was going to hear it first from that dry lizard of a man. He said he wanted tests done, but I wouldn't let him. Dizzy asked, "How could you stop him? I mean, he was the right hand of the king, and he had you caught. How could you just say no?" She smiled. "Well, Ashford was in a bit of a bind himself. I didn't realize how much until later. See, if he killed me or locked me up, Richard would have had his head. Seriously, had him beheaded. But if he didn't kill me, he had to find a way to make sure I kept my mouth shut. After that, it was just business. He had to ask for everything he could get, and give me as little as he could to buy my silence. If I didn't like the deal, I could go to the newsies and shout scandal. See, Richard hadn't married the Queen yet, wasn't even engaged, but Ashford had already picked up. See, Richard hadn't married the Queen yet, wasn't even engaged, and Ashford had already picked her out and started the process. A sex scandal right then would have ruined everything for him, so there was room on both sides for negotiation. She shook her head. And I thought I was so clever. I took the money, moved to Seattle, and started working short cons. I missed Richard, of course, but that's the nature of the game. You don't get too attached, right? Lizzie could see her eyes glisten as she lied to herself. She took a deep breath and continued. It turns out there's a lot of stuff you can do as a poor pregnant woman that you never could have got away with as a single girl. Yeah, that's okay. That you could never get away with. I'll do it again. It turns out there's a lot of stuff you can do as a poor pregnant woman that you could never get away with as a single girl. The money I saw in those few months was more than I'd ever made on the streets before, and I didn't even need it because I still had Ashford's payoff, but the whole time I was worried about you. She looked into his eyes and shook her head. I'm not mommy material, Vince. I knew it then, and nothing I've seen has convinced me otherwise. I live a life of lies, and I know it. I didn't want to bring up a child who watched me lie to one person after another just to get money. She stared into the middle distance. It's funny. I have no problem with the life itself, but I wouldn't ever want to raise a child that way. She shook her head, frowning. You know, I even thought about doing that old cliché where you show up in the middle of a fancy party and say, I want you to meet your son, Richard. I didn't even know what I would have gained from it. More money, I guess. And even though I never would have done it, the mercenary side of me said it was a marker I could call whenever I wanted. She sighed. It's fine to be all philosophical about it when you're pregnant, but when you were actually born, everything changed. She sighed. It's fine to be all philosophical about it when you're pregnant, but once you were actually born, everything changed. I couldn't move around the way I wanted to. I had to be there, caring for you, eating into all my savings. I couldn't work. I got bored out of my mind, and I didn't know anybody except for a few other grifters I'd met in Seattle. I was seriously thinking about giving you up for adoption. Dizzy had been listening with rapt attention, but hearing that woke him out of the stupor. A sneer touched his lips, and he remembered how she had treated him. She stared at him and waited, watching his face, nodding. That's right. I deserve it. I was ready to get rid of you because you were cramping my style. That's your mother in a nutshell. Then one day, I walk into my apartment and there's 3 guys waiting for me. 2 knee breakers and Richard. I was standing there, my hair a mess, grocery bags hanging from my elbows and no makeup. But he looks at me with nothing but love. He looked at you and, my God, that smile. She took a deep breath and said, Your father loved you, Vince. He loved you from the moment he saw you there in my arms. I'll never know how he did it. Tracked me down, got away from Ashford without knowing. I'll never know how he did it. Tracked me down, got away from Ashford without him knowing. All I know is that he loved you, and he loved me, and it killed him to let us go. We sat down to talk about it. He wanted me to. He watched me change you. He'd married the Queen. He said she was a fine woman, so I guess it must be true. I could tell he didn't love her, though. She sighed and looked down at her hands. Well, perhaps that... She sighed and looked down at her hands. Well, maybe that's just the view of a vain old woman. Either way, he knew you were his, no question. He wanted to help you so much. He gave me more money, asked if I needed anything. She frowned. I asked him to leave us alone. I thought about that con, the one where I introduced you at the party, and it disgusted me. I wanted him to live his life, and I wanted to live mine. I even thought I could figure out something for you. He didn't stay long. They watched him closer than ever. I think his wife had a hand in that. In any case, he left us alone again, and I'd swear I felt more alone. In any case, he left us alone again, and I'd swear I felt more alone this time than the last. The lady put one hand to her face and took a deep breath. After that, it was just the two of us on the streets. As soon as you were old enough to walk, you were a distraction for the rubes that let me slit purses. As you got older, I taught you how to lift valuables while I sang for our supper. I still had a fairly decent voice back then, and a girl singing on the Elway was common enough. I still had a fairly decent voice back then, and a girl singing in the Elway was normal enough. I still had a fairly decent voice back then, and a girl singing in the Elway was normal enough that people would stop and throw coins right before you picked the rest of their pockets. Yeah. I still had a fairly decent voice back then, and a girl singing in the Elway was normal enough that people would stop and throw coins right before you picked their pockets. She looked at him and nodded proudly. You had good hands and a quick mind. For some reason, it never occurred to me you might get pinched. After all, you were no more than 7 by this. After all, you couldn't have been 7 by the time we started really working. Who would have suspected you? Dizzy remained quiet. He vaguely remembered those days. He remembered his mother grinning. He remembered his mother's grinning face as they counted bills and threw them in the air with excitement. She said, We hung around with other grifters, and you were like a good luck charm for the bunch. They adopted you as much as any parents could, feeding you what scraps they scrounged, sharing their tricks and songs and stories with you. That's where we met Sully, you know. Dizzy nodded. He knew Sully. He knew Sully better than any of them. She said, So we ran through the money. I was never good with money back then. It all went into games and deco and famous... It all went into games and deco and expensive food and toys. She held up one hand suddenly. Never booze or drugs. I'd seen what happened to those that got into that, and we were going to be the smart ones. I was a designated driver of the thieving scene, the last one awake at the end of the poker game, if you take my meaning. But then one day, you and I were pulling the distressed stranger con. Please, sir, won't you help my mother? She's having fits and I can't afford a cab to get her to the hospital. No, let's do that. Urchin voice. But then one day, you and I were pulling the distressed stranger con. Please, sir, won't you come help my mother? She's having fits and I can't afford a cab to get her to the hospital. Turned out you picked an undercover narc. That wouldn't have been so bad in itself, as we learned how to scamper at the first sign of metal, but this one knew me. I'd taken him before. So when he come to help and he saw me, he knew we were scamming him. He got up close, made a grab. He got up close, then made a grab for me. I recognized him at the last second, and I rolled. You and I were running, and he was hot on our tracks. We knew how to handle it, though. Split up and regroup. I told you to find Sully, and that I'd meet you later. Dizzy whispered. The last thing you ever said to me. She shook her head sadly. When we split, he went for me. I could have got away from him, but he had a partner, and I didn't know it. Next thing you know, I'm pistol whipped and out cold. I wake up in Holden. She took a deep breath. They didn't have anything on me, because nobody reported the older stuff, and we never actually got off with anything from him. Anything off of him for this one. They didn't have anything on me, because nobody reported me on the older stuff, and we never actually got anything off of him for this one. They threatened to go for you, but I knew you'd be all right with Sully. Dizzy broke in. Why didn't my father help you? She shook her head. I honestly don't know. Maybe he realized they didn't have nothing on me. Maybe he wasn't watching as close as I thought. Maybe the Queen wouldn't let him. No sense wondering over maybes. And honestly, that never bothered me as much as... She stared into the middle distance, her face growing slack. Dizzy pressed. Go on. She sucked in breath and said, So there I was, released, on my own and free to go. I thought they might have a tracker on me, see if I met up with you, but I never really worried about that. If they had anything on me, they'd have already used it. Now I was free, and nobody knew where I was. I could go anywhere. So you ran away. When a job goes bad, you start up somewhere new. That's the oldest true... When a job goes bad, you start up somewhere new. That's the oldest rule in the book. I knew how much Sully and the boys loved you. I knew you'd be all right. And I was just getting in your way anyway, slowing you down. If you didn't have to drag me along with you. If you didn't have to drag me along when you ran, you could have got away clean. She stared at him for a long time, then nodded. Go ahead. You're right. I thought all of that and more. I didn't do it for you. I did it for me, and I never looked back. There was no pride in her voice as she said that. She just shook her head. I have to assume Sully did right by you. I mean, just look at you. She tried to smile, but it didn't work. She tried to smile, but it didn't work. Dizzy nodded. Sully kept me in the house for a while, waiting for you. He made up fanciful stories about how you got pinched and shipped off, but you were fighting to escape prison and come back to me. He did that for years, and slowly, we both just accepted the truth. She blinked at him. What did he do with you? Put me in the back, mostly. I was the roper on a few of his long cons, finding the mark and then testing to see if he was financially flush and morally curious. Yeah, I'll let that stay. Sully never let me get into the thick of it, but I think he was just trying to find a place for me where I wouldn't get in the way and still earn my keep. Then one day, he tells me he's shipping me off. Dizzy does not speak with a Brooklyn accent. Nor do I. I mean, just going for a general New Yorker. But anyway. Then one day, he up and tells me he's shipping me off. I'd been saving my share for years, putting a bit away where I could, trying to get enough scratch together to track you down. He knew it, and I think he knew that I didn't. He knew it, and I think he knew that I didn't want to find the answer. So instead, he tells me he's got a better idea. He tells me I have to use all my money to sign up for a finishing school. The lady's eyes widened. I didn't know that really existed. Dizzy nodded. The Malcolm Rutherford Holden Institute of... Can you imagine me tripping on that one? Try again. Dizzy nodded. The Malcolm Rutherford Holden Institute of Regentrification. After that I started working much easier cons. Dizzy paused for a moment, then said, I think Sully may have been trying to get rid of me, but he did just about the kindest thing he possibly could. He may have saved my life. Dizzy looked down at his lap for a moment and then took a deep breath and continued. And that's why I called you here. I honestly didn't mean to spend so much time talking about my father. I need you to do something for me. The lady nodded and grinned. I am here to serve my liege. A sad tone followed. I owe you a lot, kid. Dizzy ignored the comment. Find Sully. Talk to whoever you need to talk to. Talk to whoever you need to talk to. I can't do it because I'm being watched all the time, but you still have some freedom of movement. I need you to talk to him because I need him to get a team together. There's people he knows, and I need their help. She nodded. It will be done. Oh! She looked up suddenly, a trace of fear in her eyes. Have you spoken with Lord Valen yet? Dizzy blinked at her. No? Who's he? She leaned back in her seat. Nobody important to the king. I just know he was looking for you, and... You know what? I'm going to have her not drop the accent at that point. Which means backing up a little bit. She nodded. It will be done. Oh! She looked up suddenly, a trace of fear in her eyes. Have you spoken to Lord Valen yet? Dizzy blinked at her. No? Who is he? She leaned back in her seat. Nobody important to the king. I just knew he was looking for you, and I just wanted to see if you'd talked to him yet. Dizzy nodded and took a deep breath. For a moment, all the different things he was carrying around in his head seemed to spin around him, reorganizing and blurring into one another. He leaned his head into his palm. The Dowager Queen reached out one hand and placed it over his. Is everything all right? Dizzy shook his head. No, not yet. I think I'm about to... No, not yet. I think I'm to be assassinated, and unless I play my cards right, I won't live to see next week. Okay, there you go. 30 minutes, 35 seconds of recording. The second half of Chapter 11. I hope it has been entertaining and possibly educational if you're thinking about making a podcast in a closet. See you guys later.